Thank you so much. Yeah, this psalm is the most important psalm in terms of the cross, and it is called for that reason the Psalm of the Cross. You can see the outline there, and again, if you download the whole program, you will see much more than that. You will see also the references that go with it. And I think that'll be helpful to you. So awaketoisrael.org, and then you can download it there. But Messiah is despised, rejected, humiliated. And much of this language comes obviously out of the book of Isaiah, but this is put in a poetic version. Now, think about this outline for a second. If you were God and you were stepping into humanity, or if you are anybody, would you want to be despised, rejected, mocked, beaten? The plow has plowed my back as though it is a field to be plowed. Much of this language, again, comes back in Isaiah 50, Isaiah 52, 53. Painful. To be impaled on the cross, the most shameful way to die. The prophecy of the casting of the lots for his garments. I mean, it's an amazing prophecy, and no bone broken. Not out of this psalm, but there are plenty of connections to this. Again, remind ourselves that this is part of a trilogy, Psalm 22, 23, and 24. Yeshua, the good shepherd who lays down his life, Psalm 22. The great shepherd, Psalm 23, who cares for the others, Hebrews 13:20. And the great shepherd that is overseeing all, Psalm 24, connecting it to 1 Peter 5:4. These are very significant kind of psalms. And right at the start of this is this psalm. Within the Jewish community, we're taught that this is problematic, and it may or may not be about the Messiah, and it becomes very confusing over who this is. And to some degree, they are trying to fit this into the life of David, but at no time in the life of David do we see such intensity in his suffering. Now, David suffered many times, from friends, from enemies, from family, you name it. But at no stage did it affect him so much as this. And so this was clearly a prophetic statement that he made. The impalement, the putting on the cross, did not become a way of killing people until 600 years after this was written. And so it is clearly a prophetic statement. And when it became a very prominent way to do it during the Persian period, they would crucify people on the city walls. Initially just a few, and later on the Romans, they really make it into a sport almost. So if you have a Bible, I hope you have it open to Psalm 22. It is that lament psalm for the choir director upon the Ayelet HaSha'ar, a psalm of David. We're not quite sure what those opening words might mean. It might be an instrument, it might be a particular song. Upon the Ayelet might indicate an instrument or some harp in particular, we don't know. And some translations have on the deer of the dawn, as though it's a melody. So it's a particular thing that he would sing. Now, this psalm, when you read through it, is a lament psalm. The most common psalms in the Bible are lament psalms. It's a shame, and I say that loudly. It's a shame that the church is not embracing lament psalms as a whole. These are the most common psalms, lament psalms, both individual and community laments. And it means that we haven't learned to embrace that and lament with one another. But within this individual lament psalm, it's about the suffering servant, the Messiah himself, and it connects us with two passages really. As I indicated, Isaiah 53, but also to the binding of Isaac. Because I can imagine Isaac lamenting at some stage about this whole thing in Genesis 22, verses 18 to 22. So here, this opening, we know the author, therefore, of David. It's a psalm, it's something to be sung, probably upon some form of a harp, and the melody, the deer of the dawn, perhaps, a song of David. The cry can hardly be more dramatic if you wanted to. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? In all his life, he has been in direct communication with his Father, all his life, except on that moment on the cross, Matthew 27, verses 46, Mark 15, 34, where they quote this. This is the only verse in the whole of the Bible that is quoted in 3 languages, in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And so it shows you how significant this is. It expresses that deep agony of Messiah when he's on that cross, but no longer in communication with his Father, no longer hearing what his Father had to say morning by morning to educate him, to guide him in all things. Now he is all alone. My God, why have you forsaken me? When Yeshua is put on the cross, he is there, and the first 3 hours he suffers the wrath of man. People taunted him, people abused him, terrible time. But in the second part of those hours on the cross, he is forsaken by God himself. And as I said, it's the first time. It is when the wrath of God is poured out upon him rather than upon us, to whom the punishment is due. And so he addresses God not as Father, as he has done every single other time. My Father, Holy Father, our Father. He now states, God, my God, as though he is in a different relationship, no longer in a paternal relationship, father-son, but in a judgmental relationship. He was being judged at that very moment, and so not a paternal relationship, but God. Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. The word for groaning here really could be roaring like a lion. Far from my deliverance are the words of my roaring out. And he is, as though he is crying out to the Lord like a lion, here I am. I have done what you've wanted me to do. Where are you now? Why do you stand so far off, O Lord? And why do you hide yourself in trouble? Psalm 10, you can almost hear that in the background. Why do you stand so far off? As though there is frustration with him. You see, the physical sacrifice of Yeshua that he had to present his body was always clear. That was, Isaiah 53 is abundantly clear, that he would die. Psalm 22 is abundantly clear. But at this point, he is separated from the Father for the very first time. And so in that sense, it is different. And so God is standing far off, and he is all alone. There is no apparent deliverance for him. And so he cries out, my God, my God. The writer of Hebrews mentions the experience of Yeshua. In the days of his flesh, he offered up both prayers and supplication with loud cryings and the tears to the one able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his piety. God did hear the prayers, but God chose not to save him. Within some churches we hear, God will always save you, don't you worry about that. But sometimes God allows us to go through the experience, including death, testing our faith. Are we with Him? And that's a tough one. And that's why we need to sing and read these psalms that deal with the lament. Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I have no rest. He's crying out. Now, he was only on the cross for, 6 hours. There is no doubt that that was a very short period of time. And so during the day, before those 3 hours, the last 3 hours on the cross, when God poured out the darkness upon the world, and God did not answer. And he has no solace. Yet you are the Holy One, who is enthroned upon the praise of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were delivered. In you they trusted and were not disappointed. And you can sense him on the cross saying, I'm crying out to you. Despite your silence, I'm expressing my confidence as my fathers have done. His full confidence is with God, for God remains the Holy One, even when going through a trial. For God had set him apart. He had trained him morning by morning, Isaiah 50 verse 4. And so he understood the calling that he had. In verses 3 to 5, he recounts that deliverance from God in the past, indicating that God is able. But even if he doesn't, even if God chooses not to, I will trust. In verses 6 to 10, we see his description then. But I'm a worm and not a man, a reproach of men and despised by the people. All who see me sneer at me. They separate with the lips. They wag their head, saying, commit yourself to God. Let him deliver you. Let him rescue you, because he delights in you. Yet you are he who brought me up from the womb. You made me to trust upon my mother's breast. Upon you I was cast from birth. You've been my God from my mother's womb. By comparing himself to a worm, worthless, really, that's what he's indicating. David is indicating that Messiah's vulnerability, worthlessness, the contempt that he must have felt, and particularly in the eyes of the enemies. He was less than human. The techelet here is also used for the garments to be made. And so he is to be squeezed out, that little gland, to be used for a drop to make something else. And it shows you again there is little here. The Lord's servant is called a worm in Isaiah 41:14. Even though he's the ideal representative of Israel, he was the one to be despised. Isaiah 49:7, Isaiah 53:3, of whom men shrink with horror as scarcely human. Isaiah 52:14 and 53:2-3. And yet here he is, the Holy One, like a little grub, a crimson crop, to be used for dye and nothing more, to be squeezed his life. And the foes are around him, are insulting him, despising him, mocking him. It's not that he didn't have the ability to stop them. He could have come down from the cross and called upon legions of angels, but he chose not to. He chose to limit himself and chose to suffer, chose to rely on God, who chose not to rescue him for our sake. They were shaking their head in rejection, Psalm 109, verse 25, and perhaps even in astonishment, Lamentations 2:15 fits within that. The Lord spoke of his enemies who were surrounding him on the cross. Matthew 27 talks about this, verses 42 to 43. And again, to really delve with this, open two Bibles, Isaiah 53 on the one, Psalm 22, and look at the comparisons. Because these comparisons can be found in the taunts, the evil speech of the men that are surrounding him. The words used here are indeed similar to the ridicule that he suffered at the cross from those who came by. Think about it for a second. They were separating the lips, they were wagging their lips, shaking their heads, saying, "Commit yourself." Had he not done that? He did. Let him deliver you. It is said in derision, let him rescue you, because he delights in him. How painful it must have been at that point to compare yourself to a grub, to a nothing, to a worm, while these men in their regal garments, because this is at Passover time that he's crucified, who were there with their priestly garments or their prophetic garments, standing around saying, "Hey, I'm somebody, and you are nothing." True wealth is not always indicated by the garments we wear. We know that, but it's still perceived there. The world looked then and it looks today. Who is he? Is he that worthless worm? Is he to be despised? And still today, that is the key. He still bears the reproach of men and is still despised by humanity at large. And note the similar language in Psalm 69, verses 18 to 22. "O draw near to my soul and redeem it. Ransom me because of my enemies. You know my reproach and my shame and my dishonor. All my adversaries are before you. Reproach has broken my heart, and I'm sick. And I looked for sympathy, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. They also gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. May their table become a snare, and when they're at peace, may it become a trap." We see that same language, and we really ought to pause. They're always before you, the enemies. They've broken my heart. He's to the point that he takes on the diseases of the world, so to speak, and so he is sick. But in the rabbinic writings, he is called the leper scholar, the Messiah, because he takes upon himself all our diseases, all our filthiness. And yet he looked for sympathy and found none, no comforters, instead gall and vinegar. That last phrase that we see here, "may their table become a snare," that's kind of problematic language for many Christians. It's called imprecatory language, a language that invokes a curse. We don't normally do that. We don't say, "curse you," and go to church and be happy and sing happy songs. But at the same time, there comes a point when this is allowable. And that's what we see here. Our first responsibility is to pray for our enemies, to bless our enemies. True. But even Jesus and Paul and Peter and many of the Psalms contain that imprecatory language where they say, in the end, "may you be handed over." And that's what we see here. May that table become a snare. And when they are in peace, may it become a trap. This is the third and the final lament. Within this particular psalm, it contains individual laments. And so David is clearly speaking beyond himself. While we can see David often fatigued on the run of his enemies, but not to this point. He certainly didn't suffer that greatly. Messiah suffers on behalf of others so that he may become that redeemer, that ransom for me. As the firstborn, he has the right to redeem. The redemption was always made with a price. Exodus 13, verse 13, or Exodus 34, 20, Leviticus 27, 27. But also look at Leviticus 25, at the role of the Redeemer. He came to redeem, and he brought redemption, that ransom that he brought. Pada in Hebrew, and the word for goel, redeemer, is that kinsman redeemer. He had to be one of us to redeem us. And so God in his divinity could not redeem us, but it was the man Christ Jesus who saved us. He had to step into humanity to become our goel, our kinsman redeemer. And because of that, he could redeem us. And the price that he had to pay was his life. And so Messiah's enemies here broke him as they bring on the reproach, the shame and dishonor, which is placed upon him, making him sick, making him longing for sympathy and comfort. And like Job's comforters, they brought no comfort. They only made it worse. With Job it is with words, here it is with physical items, with vinegar and gall, bitterness. They brought no relief, and that's what we see on the cross. Nevertheless, Jesus draws strength from remembering that God had sustained him all his life, even from birth, from his mother's womb. And note that repetition. You brought me up from the womb. You've made me trust upon my mother's breast. From birth I was cast upon you. From my mother's womb. There is that incredible connection here, consistently referring back to the mother. Mother, mother's breast, from the womb. Only a mother, only a woman has that. The father is not mentioned. No human father is ever mentioned of him because he was the Son of God. And so note that he has that relationship with his mother, but not with his father. His father was a heavenly being only, not a man. And so he is not mentioned in this, except for my God, who is his father, his divine father. We see that same kind of language in Isaiah 7, verse 14, where it talks about that he would be born from a virgin. But I trust upon you since I was born. I was guided by you. You have been my God. And so too now I strengthen myself by remembering who you are and what you've done. Verses 11 to 15. Be not far from me, for trouble is near and there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls from Bashan have encircled me. They opened wide their mouth at me as a ravening, as a roaring lion. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. And you lay me in the dust of death. As the enemies approach Messiah, he's well aware of who they are and what they want. The enemies here are described in animalistic language. They are strong and dangerous bulls, plural, and a lion. It's interesting that there is the plural and the singular. These bulls come from Bashan. The modern name for this would be the Golan Heights, the territory on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, up north on the plateau. Lots of rain, therefore strong bulls. You see that kind of language and connection in Numbers 32, verses 1 to 5, and Amos 4:1. And it was a territory known for strong cattle. The animal motif includes two, plural, strong bulls. These would be the Gentiles. But also a singular, a lion. And the lion, when it's representative of a nation, it would be the Jewish nation. And so they come together to despise, to pick out that weak worm, that insignificant man. And because of that, he is in distress. And David describes Messiah as being poured out. In temple times, there was physical sacrifices, but often they went paired with drink offerings, wine offerings, and they would be libation offerings. And so he is poured out as water. When a lot of sacrifices were made, the altar would be covered in blood, and so water would be poured to cleanse the altar. And that's what we see here. A jar of water or wine was turned upside down and emptied out. And so Messiah too would be drained out completely, out of all his strength. His bones are out of joint. And this happened at the crucifixion. We often, and particularly in some of the paintings, when we look at paintings like Dali, Salvador Dali, you have Jesus on a cross that is 1 kilometer high. But crosses weren't that high. They would be stuck on a crossbeam, nailed down, then on the top, on the stretch, and then the whole thing would be dropped into a hole, about 1/2 meter deep, sometimes a little bit deeper, to make sure that it would stay upright. But everybody could see what is written above him. So it wasn't high. But when they picked you up, you would be dropped. And because you were tied up, your bones would become out of joint. And that's what we see here. The person nailed to the cross would be nailed upon the ground, on the cross that was lying on the ground, and then dropped in a deep hole to keep the cross upright. But multiple dislocations happened. It hastened death. His mind, his spirit are all now at that point of, where am I, Lord? Where are you? It is melting away like hot wax, devoid of energy and physically broken as a pottery that is broken. His tongue cleaves to my jaw. He is thirsty as he is left on the cross with no one to care for. Normally soldiers would be placed near a cross so that no one would take them off. And so during these hours on the cross, particularly those last 3 hours, he is there in total darkness. It is then that he cries out, I thirst. It is during those intense moments that he cries out, my God, my God. And when he says he's thirsty, I understand, like, if you haven't drunk for a while, you would be thirsty. But there is another thought that comes with that. In Luke 16, Yeshua had explained an account of the rich man who had died and Lazarus. And there was the place of Sheol, or the afterlife. And one of them was in Abraham's bosom, while the other one was what we would describe as hell. And the rich man who's described as in hell says, send him, Lazarus, and let him bring some drops of water. It is as if Jesus is saying, I've experienced hell. He suffers those pains on our behalf. It is we who should have gone to that place, for none of us are righteous, no, not one. But he chose to go there for us. In verse 16 to 18, for dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers have encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet, and I can count all my bones. They look, they stare at me. They divide my garments amongst them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Here the animal motif changes from strong bulls and lions to one word, dogs. It is they that had surrounded them. And think about that shepherd motif again. If you're walking with 100 sheep or even 50 sheep on a long, narrow stretch, you can only be at the front or at the back. But what is your enemy? Well, the lion, that's possible. But more likely the wild dogs. They would be roaming around, and so these are now surrounding him. And they would be just there, running up the hill, just taking one animal at a time. Often they wouldn't finish the animal, but damaging it so severely that it would die of its wounds. And so here the enemies are described as dogs, surrounding him to finish him off, as it were. And they pierced my hands and my feet. And this happened when they nailed him to the cross, Luke 24, verses 39 to 40. Now, if you're reading this in a Jewish translation, it'll be different. It'll say this. It'll be a different verse. The verse numbers are not so significant because what we have as superscript for the choir director upon the Ayala, they have as verse 1, so it'll be a later verse. So instead of verse 16, it'll be verse 17. And it says this, "For dogs have encompassed me, a company of evildoers have enclosed me. Like a lion, they're at my hand and my feet." Like a lion, rather than they have pierced my hands and my feet. Ka'ari, Ari means lion, Ariel, some of you will be familiar with that, Lion of God, Ari. And so that would be a possibility, and it's the smallest letter, the letter Yud, and if you extend it, it becomes the letter Vav, and that would be Karu, and that would mean pierced. So the question is it like a lion or is it pierced? Jewish people have said, no, it's got to be like a lion. But then a new animal motif is brought in that is not quite there. The enemies have been described here as an evil company of dogs that are surrounded him. And like a lion, they're around him. And that would be the singular. Which one is it? Well, Jewish tradition was very strong. No, it is like a lion. We do not accept it. And with one voice, they said this until they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And at that point, they backpedaled a little. Because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it says they have pierced. Again, it is very clear that they dug through his hands, so to speak, or dug into his hands, so that this would be opened up so that he would hang on that cross for us. Again, the Jewish translation will be reading different, but just be aware that the oldest copy of the Bible that we have in Hebrew, the Septuagint, does indicate that it is pierced. The word for piercing is not the same as the word for piercing in Zechariah 12:10. Again, it's a very different word than it means to stabbing or to thrust through, which also is messianic, and that goes beyond our text for today, but it would be more that they stabbed him through in terms of the sword or the spear that stabbed him while he was on the cross. The word here is different. It would be more of a direct piercing through by nails, or sometimes for an earring or a nose ring, back in those days more common. And so Messiah's description here is of agony, weakened, physically weakened, his bones out of joint, possibly showing at this point by the weight of distress. And so he prays, "But you, O Lord, be not far off. O you, my help, hasten to my assistance. Deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen. You answer me." Messiah is calling out, pleading with God to rescue him from this vital and final attack of the enemies. And he's referring to them as wild animals. He cried out to God to be near him and to act swiftly to save him. There is a change that happens within these verses. Save me from the lion's mouth. And he's recognizing that they will swallow him up from the horns of the wild oxen. And then that last phrase, you, Lord, you answer me. as though it has been completed, as though he has received his help at that point. In the opening verse 19, he says, "You are my help, hasten me. But now," or "give me strength, my strength." But it's a description of that the Lord is called upon. And again, against these enemies that are coming in, this animal motif. In verses 22 to 31, we see the resurrection and the assurance. "I will tell of your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him. All you descendants of Israel, for he has not despised nor abhorred the afflicted. Abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to help to him, he heard. When you come, my praise in the great, from you come my praise in the great assembly. I shall pay my vows before those who fear you." That last phrase in verse 21, "You answer me," could well be stuck really here. Verse numbers and chapter divisions did not exist in the Bible. And so this may well be fitted more to verse 22. Because at this point there is that change that happened. "And therefore I will tell of your name." Since he suffered and the dogs came in to take him away, he has died. And so now, I believe the view here is that Messiah has vowed to do two things. Tell the story of his deliverance. And to some degree, Israel does that every year at the Passover. We see that kind of language in Exodus 10, Exodus 13, and sing God's praises publicly. And again, that connects with the Passover, the Song of Moses, Exodus 15 or Psalm 42, etc. God allowed Israel to go through, God allowed Messiah to go through this, so that in the end it would be seen that he could taste death, but would also be raised back to life. The promise for resurrection is guaranteed to us in particular if we are in Messiah. He is the firstborn of the dead, Colossians 1:18. And so Messiah is called upon here, Messiah calls upon us here to worship with him. "All you descendants of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him, all you descendants of Israel." It is that what we are called to do. And sadly, we don't, because we don't recognize who this Messiah is. Messiah calls upon all to join him in praising God, because God has come to his aid. Messiah vowed to give his life as a ransom. He now promises to complete his vows by giving praise. And note that it's before those who fear him. So not just to the children of Israel, the children of Jacob, Israel the nation, but to all who fear the Lord. All the families of the earth are now invited to join in. In verses 26 to 31, we see the testimony then. "The afflicted will eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him will praise the Lord. Let your heart live forever. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will worship before you. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he rules over all the nations. All the prosperous of the earth will eat and worship. All those who go down to the dust will bow down before him, even those who cannot keep his soul alive. Prosperity will serve him. It will be told of the Lord to the coming generations. They will come and declare his righteousness to a people who will be born, that he has performed it." I see Yeshua interpreting these verses when he says, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The poor are the afflicted ones. Like him, they were afflicted. Matthew 5, Luke 6. We join him in his affliction. Not that we suffer on others, or on the behalf of others, but we suffer on our own behalf for the purification. God allowed this to happen so that we all would be purified before him, but that we, the afflicted ones, the poor, would now be freed and therefore could worship with him, sing, praise. For the King, Psalm 2, the suffering servant, Isaiah 53, who died and rose, will bring forth praise, and all are to worship him. Yeshua is the afflicted one of God, who gives food and satisfaction and strength, because he has completed his task. The Lord rules over the living, but also over those who died. Not just one nation, but all the nations. His kingdom extends to the living and the dead. And all will bow down before him, even those who cannot keep their life. These would be those who die in the second death. He addresses those who are in Hades. They too will acknowledge the lordship of the King. Philippians 2, verses 10 to 11, Revelation 5, 13 to 14. And not only those who have already and who are alive at that point, but future generations will serve him. They will tell, they will declare. And it's the calling that we have. We are to tell, we are to declare, we are to serve Yeshua, the coming King, and declare with one voice what he has done. Future generations, that's you and me. You could put your name in this and say, that's my calling. Now I wonder if we do that. They will come and will declare his righteousness. Do we do that? It means also declaring that we are unrighteous and we need to come into his righteousness. Well, Psalm 22 is a graphic description of the death of the crucifixion, from his cry to his bones being out of joint, the intense suffering, the emotional state of his heart, his physical strength being exhausted, and extreme thirst, the piercing of his hands and his feet. In one word, the crucifixion, the method of death that he did not deserve, but with a promise that he would be raised and that all would serve him. Friends, I wonder if we do that. I spoke about Psalm 89 in the previous section. In Psalm 89, verses 51 to 52, we have this: with which your enemies have reproached, O Lord, with which they have reproached the footsteps of your anointed one, in the Targum. Blessed be the Lord forever and ever. You see, there too we see the suffering, but we see it connected with the footsteps of the Messiah. Now, the footsteps of your anointed one are not in the text in the normal translations, but it is there in the Targum. And it reminds me of what Peter says, 2 Peter 3:9, that the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promises, as some count slowness, but he is patient towards you, not wishing that any of you should perish, but that all should reach repentance. See, some are mocking and saying, where is he? Where is the Lord? Where is the footsteps of the anointed? They all recognize he is the despised one, the rejected one, the one who came and suffered, the man of sorrows. And they might even recognize the stone that was rejected by the builders. But are they willing to recognize that he rose from the dead? And that resurrection is our hope, that he will come again and set up his kingdom, when he sets up that cornerstone for the kingdom to come. Friends, that's our Messiah. The suffering servant, as I mentioned, is Isaiah 50 verse 6, or I gave my back to those who strike me, my cheek to those who pluck out my beard. I did not cover my face from humiliation and spitting, which you find back in Psalm 129. They've persecuted me from my youth up. And I gave my back to the smiters we find in the plough plowed upon my back. Messiah was already rejected well and truly before he went to the cross. And when we think about his life today, he is exalted far above any other place, but here on earth, he is still despised and still rejected. And so it is us who got to now tell the nations that this is not the case, that we should bring forth his praise. He was willing to suffer for us. Are we willing to suffer for him? Because he is our foreshadowing, and with him we ought to lament. Well, I wonder how much longer I have. Well, in that case, let me connect this a little bit more. The suffering servant is also foreshadowed in the law. In the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 46, it talks about the Passover lamb. Not a bone was to be broken. And that's exactly what happened. His bones were out of joint, but not broken, which was the common method to do. Once people were placed on the cross, outside of the land of Israel, they were just left to hang. They didn't break their bones. But within the land of Israel, because of the rabbinical law, the biblical law, that you couldn't have somebody hanging overnight on the cross, they would break their bones. And the way they would do that is to have a heavy club, like a mallet, and just smash their legs in, so that they would then drop, and then it would hasten death. This did not happen. He died because he was willing to lay down his life for us. It was the Father's will to make this, so that we would receive an atonement. In Exodus 12, not a bone to be broken is what we see here in in Psalm 34:20. He kept all his bones, not one of them will be broken. That's what John 19 also indicates, verse 33 to 36. While the other criminals, their legs are broken to hasten death, John specifically mentions that not a bone was broken. Friends, he didn't need to have his bones broken. He fulfilled that Passover lamb. And so it's not just that we connected to Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, but beyond that to Exodus 12, and beyond that to Genesis 22, the near sacrifice of Isaac. In the sacrifice of Isaac, Isaac was a willing sacrifice. In Jewish tradition, he's 37 years of age. Now, Jesus is born, we often think in the year 0, but that year didn't exist. But Herod is still alive, and Herod dies 5 BC. And so he has to be born before that. So give it 2 years before or a year before, it makes him about that same age as Isaac was on the cross. Isaac was a willing sacrifice. His father is 100 years old. He could have easily said to his father, I'm not doing that, but he chose to be that willing sacrifice. Abraham has to kill the lamb first, slays the lamb, and then puts it literally under Isaac as a substitute for Isaac, and then takes Isaac off the altar. And that's what we see here. It is we who should have been put on the cross for our sins, but God placed him underneath us as our substitute. And so we then go free. Connecting these pictures up from Exodus 12 to Isaiah 53 to Genesis 22, and with this psalm, we see that picture of his substitutionary atonement. When you read them through Isaiah 53, God willing, May we bring that to Israel daily in remembrance, that God will take off the scales from their eyes because they connect these passages. It's what we ought to do. When Philip, the evangelist, spoke to the eunuch, he started sharing from Isaiah 53, but he didn't stop there. He used all of these passages, and that's what we got to do. Friends, I pray that in your evangelism you don't just stick with Isaiah 53. It's a great passage, but also bring them to the Psalms, which observant Jewish people read daily. And so walk with them through this psalm and show the sufferings of Messiah, how he came and was willing to die for us. I pray that you're willing to do that. I pray that you'll pray for the Jewish people, that their eyes may be opened, that they may see the Messiah who was willing to suffer for us from this passage. Selah.